Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. This is our 10th episode of the summary of the Quran, and we are going to do Surah At-Tawbah. Surah At-Tawbah is the 9th surah of the Quran and the 4th and the last surah of the second group of surahs. The group which started from Surah Al-An'am, which is the surah of invitation to the people of Quraysh, moved on to Surah Al-Araf, which was giving stern warning of serious dire consequences to the people who were addressed by the Messenger of God directly, that if they are not going to believe and mend their ways, they are going to have their punishment inflicted upon them in this very life, which is going to be a starting point of their eternal punishment. The third surah, Anfal, which we did yesterday, is the surah that is preparing the believers to finally get prepared both morally, spiritually, and militarily to inflict God's punishment on the people who were now on the verge of extinction, of being punished because of their own misdeeds, because of the fact that they rejected the Messenger of God, despite the fact that they knew quite well that he is from God and what he's saying is the ultimate truth. This they did because of their arrogance and because of the fact that there was no way that they were able to correct themselves and improve upon the evil deeds that they were doing. They were not prepared to see the right path. So they ultimately had to be punished, and this surah is the surah of punishment. That's why it's the only surah of the Quran which is not preceded by the verse Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So out of 114 surahs of the Quran, it's only Surah Tawbah which has this distinction of beginning without Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, because this verse mentions Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim as God's attributes, and the subsequent surah, had this verse been there, would have talked about God's punishment, which is not consistent in its theme with his attributes of mercy, being merciful, and his mercy lasting. So it was omitted. Surah Tawbah is talking about punishment to the people who rejected the Prophet. Who were they? We read the surah and we come to learn about the fact that they belong to three different categories. They were either the polytheists, people who were the fellow nationals, fellow tribesmen who belonged to the same city, the same surroundings as the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, belonged to. The second category were the people who belonged to the category of the people of the book. They were either Jews or the Christians. They were already following a religion from God, even though in somewhat altered, corrupted form. They knew the Prophet, that he was the same messenger about whom they had prophecies in their books, and there were many of them who rejected him because of the same reasons: arrogance, rigidity, stubbornness, and they were also punished. And finally, there was a third category of people who were the most difficult of all to be identified and to be punished. And they were the hypocrites, who had joined the ranks of Muslims, declared themselves to be Muslims, and yet they did not have Islam, faith in their hearts. So they were deceiving, dodging Muslims. We find that this surah is talking about the Almighty's punishment that was inflicted upon the kuffar, the disbelievers, to each one of these categories, and it has been mentioned in a certain sequence, one by one. The first category is the category of the polytheists. Their treatment has been discussed from verse 1 to 29. The second category is people of the book, verse 1 to 28. The punishment to the people of the book begins with verse 29 and consumes 5 or 6 verses. And thereafter, we have a longish description of the manner the hypocrites were treated, and it's a pretty long surah, and the mention of the hypocrites is therefore consumed by a much longer passage of the surah than the other two, because of the fact that they were difficult people. They belonged to the ranks of Muslims apparently, and yet they were disbelievers. So we begin with the description of the first group, the polytheists. The Quran begins by saying this is a declaration of disassociation, bara'atum min Allahi wa rasulihi, from God and His Messenger, ila alladhina ahadtum min al-mushrikeen, to those polytheists with whom you had made treaty. They are informed that they have 4 months thereafter. Either they believe or they perish. Then it was said, when the deadline was over, kill the polytheists wherever you find them and capture them, besiege them, and sit in wait for them at every place of ambush. Because they are the people now who are going to be receiving God's punishment the same way as many earlier nations had received that punishment, through mostly natural calamities. But this time round, instead of those calamities, the Almighty used the swords of the companions of the Messenger. The longish passage goes on to say, but if they repent, they say their prayers and pay their zakat, that is, in other words, they become Muslims, then let them go on their way. God is forgiving and merciful. In another of these verses, he says the same thing and says, if they repent, they say their prayers regularly and they pay zakat, then they are your brothers in religion. So you have to accept them. Verse 6 in this description is giving us a very clear reason to believe that this punishment was given to the polytheists because they knew what the truth was. So the Almighty has mentioned an exception here in verse 6, and He says, وَإِنْ أَحَدٌ مِّنَ الْمُشْرِكِينَ اسْتَجَارَكَ, and if any one of the polytheists seeks your protection, then grant him protection so that he may hear the words of God. That is, if there is a person out there or a few people who say that we don't even know what's going on, we don't know what the message is, so why are we being punished? Why are we being punished? So accept their plea, take them away to a place of safety, read out the Quran to them, then deliver him to his place of safety. That's because they are a people who don't know. When people don't know, they cannot be punished. But if people are doing things wrong knowingly, it's only then that they are eligible for God's punishment. The Almighty says in verse 14 of this surah something I believe is very important to understand. I have been saying it all along, that this punishment that the Almighty inflicted upon the disbelievers, kuffar, at the hands of the believers was God's punishment. But obviously people might say that this is something that we have come up with as an excuse, as an explanation to help people understand and be able to rationalize what happened. The fact is that the Quran has made it absolutely clear that this was indeed God's punishment. It was only that humans were being utilized for that purpose, and the important consequence of this understanding is that it was a special, unique, era-specific requirement. It had nothing to do with people's believers of the later times. So no Muslim can make use of these verses to justify that he's killing non-Muslims because they are non-believers. So the Quran mentions in verse 14, قَاتِلُوهُمْ, you fight against them, يُعَذِّبْهُمُ اللَّهُ بِأَيْدِيكُمْ, God is going to punish them through your hands. He's going to use your hands. So the Quran makes it clear that what was going on was being done under very clear instructions of the Almighty to make sure that those who had refused to pay heed to God's message were to be taken to task, so that this incident, this very prominent happening, should become a lesson for the rest of the mankind to know and believe that God's punishment is real. If He is warning you that if you are not going to mend your ways, there is punishment waiting for you after this life, in the next life, then what He is saying is correct. And if you don't believe, just look at this punishment which we are inflicting upon the enemies of our messenger, the rejectors of truth, after this punishment was prophesied much earlier, on occasions at a time when this punishment was not imaginable. There were no traces of it happening. And yet it was confidently prophesied over and over again that these people are bound to meet with God's punishment, and the punishment actually took place. So this is what the Quran is doing in this particular surah, mentioning the fact that the promised punishment has now arrived, reached. Verse 28 says, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu, believers, innamal mushrikuna najasun. Now these polytheists are impure, they are filthy. Therefore, they must not come close to the sacred house after this year. This was a part of the punishment. We do have different religious views. We do dispute with many people in the kind of religious views they carry, but they are not impure or filthy because they have their own reasons, and we don't know who is convinced in doing what he is doing and who is not. That's something for the Almighty to decide on the Day of Judgment. But if in this life the Almighty Himself, who knows everything, tells His Prophet and his companions, here are some people about whom I am telling you that they don't deserve to survive anymore. They are filthy and they will not be allowed to come close to the house of God any further, then that's obviously something the Almighty and He alone can do. This has nothing to do with non-Muslims of later times. If there are restrictions on the entry of non-Muslims in the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, today it's an administrative decision. It's not something which is mentioned in the Quran. Then we move on to verse 29 onwards, which is a treatment of how the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians, were punished by the Almighty. It says in verse 29, fight those who do not believe in God or in the last day, and who do not consider unlawful what God and His messenger have made unlawful, and who do not adopt the religion of truth from those who were given the book. Fight them until they pay jizya. They give jizya, that is a tax to the Muslims, with their own hands, and live as humble subjects. Their punishment was not the punishment of being killed. Their punishment was living with Muslims under them a life of humbleness, ignominy, insult, that they somehow were not willing to accept the message of God even though it had become absolutely clear. It's not a small matter. You see, you can see God's message clearly that is from Him, and you're not still not willing to accept it is a big, big crime. And that's what the Almighty keeps reminding us, that for committing such crimes, the Almighty would give you lots and lots of opportunities to correct yourself. But if there are people out there who are not prepared to mend themselves and are incorrigible, then their punishment is going to be unleashed at them beyond a certain deadline which only God can decide. The Almighty mentions as to why they are being treated the way they have been treated. He says, "Yuriduna an yutfi'u nur Allahi bi afwahihim." Verse 32. They want to extinguish God's light with their mouths. They used to employ propaganda through their tongues to somehow make an attempt to undo, undermine, weaken the message of God. Whereas God has decided to perfect His light, although these disbelievers don't like it. Then we move on to verse 38 onwards, which, as I said, is the description of the third group of disbelievers, hypocrites, who were Muslims apparently, because they used to recite the kalama and everything that was demanded from them to prove that they were Muslims, but they did not have true Islam, true faith in their hearts. So because they were also disbelievers, and they disbelieved despite the fact that they knew that the message that they are rejecting is from God, they too were punished. So verse 38 says, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu ma lakum iza qila lakum unfiru fi sabilillahi thaqaltum ilal ard. Believers, what is the matter with you that when you are asked to come out in the cause of God, you suddenly slump to the earth? Now, in order to distinguish hypocrites from true Muslims, sincere Muslims, the Almighty arranged for a certain expedition. There was a declaration in Medina that there is a place distanced by hundreds of miles from Medina, Tabuk, where all able-bodied Muslim men who have the capacity, the resources to travel, must travel to fight against the Roman Empire, the superpower of that time. It was extremely hot. The time of harvest for dates was round the corner, which was a very important economic project for the people of Medina. So it was really a difficult thing to do, unless, of course, somebody had faith. So this declaration that Muslims must move out and accompany the Prophet to Tabuk was something that became a criterion that would distinguish true believers from disbelievers, hypocrites. So the Almighty is mentioning it at that point in time when this declaration was made, and there were some people who were reluctant to go. He says, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu, believers, ma lakum, what has happened to you? Iza qila lakum, when it is said to you, infiru fi sabilillah, that you move out in the cause of God, ithaqaltum ilal ard, that you slump to earth. Do you prefer the worldly life over the next one? And there is realistically no comparison between the worldly life and the next one. Then verse 40 mentions, Illa tansuruhu faqad nasarahullah. If you will not support the Prophet, O believers, O people who claim to be Muslims, if you are not going to support him, in the cause and the project that the Almighty has entrusted to him, it will be your loss. It won't harm his mission. فَقَدْ نَصَرَهُ اللَّهُ إِذْ أَخْرَجَهُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا ثَانِيَ اثْنَيْنِ. God indeed supported him, even when those who disbelieved had driven him out of Mecca as one of the two. That is, at the time of migration, when they were in the cave, and he said to his companion, do not grieve, la tahzan, indeed God is with us, inna Allah ma'ana. So the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, was with Abu Bakr, his companion, may God be pleased with him. And he says that if you're not going to support the Prophet, doesn't matter, it's going to be your loss, because God is going to accomplish his mission anyways. He, that is God, supported his Prophet, his messenger, even when he was all by himself. There was just one companion with him. So it's in your interest that you support him. In verse 43, there is this interesting message that the Almighty sends to the Prophet. As I said, the book was declared as the benchmark, as the criterion. Those who would go would be believers. Those who would not would prove that they are not. But it so happened that the Almighty did not clearly tell the Prophet that each and every person who comes to you to seek your permission to stay back, don't permit them. It was a general understanding that that's how it's going to happen. And the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, the way he was, kind, considerate, forgiving. There were some people who came to him to seek his permission that they should be allowed to stay back. And the Prophet allows them. So the Quran mentions it in this verse, Afallahu anka. O Prophet, may God forgive you. Lima zinta lahum. Why did you permit them? Permit these people who came to ask you for them to be allowed to stay back. Hatta yatabayyana lakal lazina sadaqu, until such time that it should have become clear to you who are the ones allazina sadaqu, who are truthful, wa ta'lam al-kazibin, and until such time that you should have known who the liars were. So some such incidents were also happening, and it also shows that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, on many occasions would take his own decision independently, and the Almighty would approve what he was doing because he knew what the direction was. It's not that each time that he was to take a decision, there used to come a clear revelation to him. He would follow the revelation, most certainly, but he would also follow his understanding based on that revelation. Most of the time he was spot on, but on some occasions, because of his extremely good nature, he would do things which would be somewhat different from what God expected him to do, and therefore God would correct him. Verses 75 to 77 tell us how these people became hypocrites. After all, hypocrisy is a disease, it's an illness. I mean, moral disease. But why can't we say that it wasn't their fault? It's just that they were hypocrites. The Almighty tells us that if some people became hypocrites, it was their own failing, their own undoing. So he mentions one of the reasons why some people turned out to be hypocrites was that they would promise God that if their economic conditions would improve, they'll spend and be pious. They saw that the Quran, the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, are telling people that if you will believe in God and do good deeds, you will be successful. Successful in this life and successful in the next life. So they would pray to God and say that, please make us wealthy, affluent, and we promise you that if that's what's going to happen to us, we will become pious and we will spend a lot in charity. But when God gave them prosperity, they turned their backs and became stingy. So they broke the promise they made to God. The Almighty says, فَعَاقَبَهُمْ نِفَاقًا فِي قُلُوبِهِمْ. So He made hypocrisy settle in their hearts. إِلَى يَوْمِ يَلْقَوْنَهُ, until the day they would meet Him. بِمَا أَخْلَفُوا اللَّهَ مَا وَعَدُوهُ. This happened as a consequence of breaking their deal with Him. وَبِمَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ, and for the reason that they were perpetually lying. So, if they became hypocrites, it was because they behaved improperly. And when you start doing things wrong, deliberately, consistently, without seeking God's forgiveness, then the Quran keeps telling us over and over again, hearts get twisted, rusted, hardened, blackened, and there is no way that the individual would then get the opportunity of staging a comeback. In verse 80, the Almighty is telling the Prophet, who obviously, as we have seen, and the Quran keeps telling us, was an extremely forgiving, kind person who would forgive his enemies as well. And obviously there are very prominent examples and incidents in his life. He would forgive his enemies. He would not carry grudge against anyone. So he would be inclined to seek forgiveness for the hypocrites as well. But the Almighty now, because it's a stage wherein He would want to make it absolutely clear that the truth and the untruth are absolutely demarcated, they cannot be the same. And what is right has to be distinguished from what is wrong. So He says to the Prophet, "Istaghfir lahum aw la tastaghfir lahum." It doesn't matter whether you seek forgiveness for them or you don't seek forgiveness for them. In tastaghfir lahum sab'ina marra. Even if you seek forgiveness for them 70 times, فَلَنْ يَغْفِرَ اللَّهُ لَهُمْ. God is not going to forgive them. They are the people who have disbelieved and they are stubborn. They are not inclined to correct themselves at all. So that's what the Almighty says. ذَلِكَ بِأَنَّهُمْ كَفَرُوا بِاللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. This is because they have disbelieved in God and His Messenger. وَاللَّهُ لَا يَهْدِي الْقَوْمَ الْفَاسِقِينَ. And God doesn't guide those who are defiantly disobedient. From 83 verse to 85, we have the actual punishment that was meted out to the hypocrites. They were exposed in the Muslim society. The Almighty says, if hypocrites ask you to accompany you for jihad, say no to them. So Muslims went to this expedition of Tabuk. Nothing happened there. It was just a trial meant to distinguish believers from hypocrites. When they came back, and by the way, while the Muslims were going, these hypocrites were silently, quietly rejoicing the possibility that these people would never come back. They are going to fight against this superpower of our times, and how will they be able to survive? But when their wishful thinking didn't pay off, and the Muslims and the Prophet came back, and they learned about the fact that they are returning, they started making excuses, and they would say to the Prophet that, please allow us another opportunity and we will accompany you. So the Almighty says, if hypocrites ask you to accompany them for jihad, just say no to them and don't attend the funeral prayers for any of them. It was a great privilege for believers that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, would lead the funeral prayers of those who would pass away. It would be as if uh, a very strong reason for the individual and his family members to feel confident that the Almighty is going to be kind to the person who has left this world, because God's messenger is praying for him. But this privilege was not available to the hypocrites, and it was made absolutely clear that there are some people for whom, when they die, the Prophet is not going to offer funeral prayers. And don't attend the funeral prayers for any of them, nor pray at their graves. That is, they will be buried in the same graveyard as of the believers, but don't stand on their graves and pray for them. They disbelieved God and Messenger and died as defiantly disobedience, as fasiq. Don't be impressed by their wealth and children. God wants to punish them through them in this world and wants them to leave this world as kafir, as disbelievers. So it was made very clear to all believers that these are the people, even though they have used their statement of faith as a shield to guard themselves against the direct punishment of the Almighty, they have been exposed in this very life before the rest of the believing community that they do not belong to them. Verse 100 tells us that this was the case with the hypocrites. And there was this other group of believers, the real, genuine believers. The Quran says, وَالسَّابِقُونَ الْأَوَّلُونَ مِنَ الْمُهَاجِرِينَ وَالْأَنصَارِ. And the forerunners among the people, the believers who migrated, and those who supported them with good attitude. There were these Muhajirin who migrated from Mecca, and there were these Ansar who supported them, provided them with shelter, comfort, and they never regretted the fact that they had helped the believers coming from Medina. And they were all forerunners. They excelled in faith, in good practice. وَالَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوهُمْ بِإِحْسَانٍ, as well as those who followed them in their good practice. That is, some people excelled and there were others who followed them in good conduct. The Almighty says, رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُمْ وَرَضُوا عَنْهُ. God is pleased with them and they are pleased with Him. That's the very opposite of what hypocrites were doing. So on the one hand, the hypocrisy of hypocrites was exposed very clearly. The good news of success in this world and the next world was given to the true believers. أَعَدَّ لَهُمْ جَنَّاتٍ تَجْرِي تَحْتَهَا الْأَنْهَارُ. He has prepared for them such gardens underneath which rivers would flow. خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا أَبَدًا. They shall reside therein forever. ذَلِكَ الْفَوْزُ الْعَظِيمُ. And that's a clear success. That's the great success which the Almighty wants all believers to work for. The hypocrites did whatever they could within their means to undermine and undo the message of God and the project of the Almighty, which He wanted to implement through His messenger, of dominating His message over all other messages in the Arabian Peninsula. One of the things that they did was that they made a masjid in the outskirts of Medina, bringing in this excuse that it's very difficult for some Muslims living at a distance from the Masjid al-Nabwi in Medina. So they wanted to make another masjid. These hypocrites were apparently Muslims, and they were using their Islam to deceive fellow Muslims and the messenger. So this masjid that they made was called the Masjid Zarar, which was actually the masjid, the mosque of division. It was made for the purpose, for the negative purpose of causing division amongst the ranks of Muslims. So this masjid, when it was made, the Almighty says that it's done for the cause of creating division amongst Muslims and for providing a station to the enemies. That is, there were people who would conspire against the Muslims. They would come and get a shelter over there, because when Muslims would come to strike them, they would say that, what wrong are we doing? I mean, we are in the masjid and we are saying our prayers. The Almighty clarified, clearly mentioned it to His Prophet, La taqum fihi abada. Do not say your prayer in this masjid ever. Because if you will do it, then everybody would think that this is a masjid where the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, prayed. And therefore, there is nothing wrong with it. La masjidun ussisa ala taqwa min awwali yawmin. The masjid which was founded on God consciousness right from the beginning deserves that you pray there instead. So there was another masjid that was made in the outskirts of Medina, Masjid Quba, which the Almighty encouraged the Prophet to go and pray and ignore this masjid, so that this contrast becomes clear to all Muslims, and they would also likewise not give any significance to Masjid Zarar. At the very end of the surah, the Almighty is telling believers that they should now stay away from all those who have disbelieved and have no connections with them, not even spiritual connection of praying for them. Verse 113 says, Ma kana lin-nabiyyi wal-lazina amanu an yastaghfiru lil-mushrikeen. It's not correct, it's not befitting for the Prophet nor for believers that they seek forgiveness for the polytheists. Walau kanu uli qurba, even if they were their relatives. Mim ba'di ma tabayyana lahum, even after it has become clear to them, annahum ashabul jahim, that they are the people of the hell. So if it becomes clear to somebody that a certain individual or a group of people are definitely destined to hell, then why would a believer pray for him or her? Because in that case, what you will be doing is that you will be praying against the Almighty's decision, which doesn't make sense. But apart from those people who were declared as eligible, deserving to enter the hell at the time of the Prophet, there are no other people about whom we can say with confidence that they are going to be thrown into the hellfire. And therefore, there is no reason why this verse and some similar verses should be used for Muslims to urge other fellow Muslims that they should not pray for the non-Muslims. We don't know. We don't know whether the message has become absolutely clear to these people as well or not. It is our duty to let them know what the truth is and invite as best as we can, instead of blaming them for not accepting the truth knowingly. Finally, in the very end of this surah, the Almighty says, لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ. O believers, there has come to them a messenger from within you. Azizun alayhi ma anittum. Any suffering that befalls you grieves him. Harisun alaykum bil mu'minina raufur rahim. He is eager for you to be guide and is compassionate and kind towards believers. So he eagerly guides you and is compassionate and kind towards believers. فَإِن تَوَلَّوْا, then if they still turn their backs, فَقُلْ حَسْبِيَ اللَّهُ, then say, God is enough for me. La ilaha illahu. There is no entity worthy of being worshipped except Him. Alayhi tawakkaltu, in Him alone I put my trust. Wa huwa rabbul arshil azim, and He is the Lord of the glorious throne. May the Almighty enable us to understand the message of the Quran correctly, and may He enable us to follow it to the best of our abilities.